Alrighty guys, it is Qaaman here today and I'm bringing you another Dragon Ball Super review. And in this episode, I will be reviewing episode 20 of Dragon Ball Super, which is called A Warning from Jaco. Frieza and his 1000 soldiers are drawing near. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about the plot, the action, interesting details, my overall impressions, my most memorable moments, and my thoughts on the episode as a whole. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into this video. So, let's first start off by talking about the plot. Now, it's pretty straightforward here. The plot was pretty similar to what we saw in Fukkatsu no F, in which, obviously Frieza's resurrected. He and Tagoma have a plan along with Sorbet to attack the Earth and exact their revenge on Goku and possibly Future Trunks, even though Future Trunks is not there, and everything along those lines. Now, there are some differences that deviated from the plot. The biggest difference that I noticed, which I'll explain a little bit more in my interesting details, is the fact that Frieza did not kill Tagoma in this instance, which means that Tagoma is going to be one of the main fighters for Frieza's army going against the Sea Warriors, which adds a lot more action and tension instead of it just being Sashimi, who's basically the only true major threat from his henchmen. So other than that, we also got to see Jaco, and I thought there was a great balance of having many different mini plots taking place at the same time. We saw Goku training with Vegeta, Jaco interacts with Bulma, Goten and Trunks, which was a new thing we didn't see in the original Fukkatsu no F, where they weren't even in the movie at all, and obviously the whole thing with Frieza. So I felt that even though the previews were suggesting that this episode was strictly going to focus more on Jaco, they did a great job balancing out with adding different things to the plot, which I like. Definitely because of the fact that it's making the pacing for the Fukkatsu no F arc significantly faster, unlike the first arc, and we saw many different episodes that were really slowing down the progress of the series as a whole. So I definitely like the pacing of the plot, and I definitely like the different things that they squeezed into just one episode. So in terms of action for this episode, I'll make it really brief. We only saw one action sequence that took place between Goku and Vegeta when they were training. And basically, Whis was telling them that you don't want to bring out your energy in order to alert your opponent when you're fighting. And it was a quick little sequence. I enjoyed it, and I definitely would like to have seen more of Goku training against Vegeta in the previous episodes, because I feel like one extra episode showing their training and, how they mastered Super Saiyan God would have been a lot more effective as opposed to what we're going to see coming up next, because we don't know what's going to happen with this whole Super Saiyan God, Super Saiyan transformation, Super Saiyan Blue, whatever you want to call it, because it might actually be ad-libbed, and I'm going to save that for my prediction. So that was the only real action sequence there, alongside Frieza blasting Tagoma, but that's not really an action sequence. So it was pretty good for the minor amount of time that we actually got to see it. So, as I always do in every single Dragon Ball Super episode review, I always talk about some interesting details, and the first thing I wanted to talk about that caught my attention was the fact that Frieza himself said Earth's hell when he was describing being, obviously in the afterlife. And I found this kind of interesting because of the fact that he's referring it to Earth's hell, which is implying that Earth has like its own hell. But this was very different from what we've learned in the Dragon Ball Afterlife as a whole, where we've seen Frieza in the afterlife in filler episodes with Cell, and we also saw Goku basically being in hell several times himself, and we also saw various different things about how people spoke about the afterlife in the original Dragon Ball series, where we saw like the gates with the Nin and everything along those lines. So I found it's kind of weird how Frieza's talking about Earth's hell, because it really opens up the history as to how we as fans are going to depict hell moving forward. The next thing to note is the fact that in Dragon Ball Super so far, he injured Tagoma, but he didn't actually kill him. And I feel, as I mentioned before, this is going to add a lot towards the plot, because if you don't kill Tagoma, that basically leaves Sashimi, Sorbet, even though it doesn't really seem like he's that much of a fighter. And it also leaves Tagoma to basically combat the Z fighters and put up a little bit more of a resistance, because as we saw in Fukkatsu no F, Piccolo had a brief but competitive fight against Sashimi. Other people like Josh from Dragon Ball Nation would like to say it in other terms, but I'm not going to say anything there. And, obviously considering the fact that, Piccolo had a good fight with Sashimi, now with Tagoma being there, I could see maybe Tien. Gohan would obviously knock him out very easily, but I could see possibly another competitive fight, which adds a lot more tension towards, the atmosphere as a whole. So I definitely kind of like how they ad-libbed killing off Tagoma. For my last interesting detail, I want to talk about something more along the lines of Japanese vocabulary, because from the version of Dragon Ball Super that I saw, the editor actually took notes on some Japanese words that they use that don't really translate directly into English, and I found them pretty interesting. The first one is referred to as Dokumi, which was basically taking place when Whis was talking to Beerus, and Whis was explaining why he was going to Earth, and he was saying how he wanted to be a Dokumi, which is basically a person who tests food in order to determine whether or not it's poisonous. And then what we see in the other sequence, where Bulma was talking to Jaco, and she said that Trunks mispronounced his name and called him Jaco, which is actually a Japanese translation for referring to a useless person. So I found these little words actually pretty interesting to note. You know, obviously you can't translate everything directly into English because there's certain things that don't really have just one word for it. So I found that pretty cool. In terms of my impressions for this episode, I got the feeling that this did not feel like a filler episode, and the reason I'm saying this is because it did advance the plot, where we saw Bulma talking to Jaco, we saw Goku fighting with Vegeta on, Beerus's planet, obviously training, and we also got to see Frieza talking with his men, basically planning out what they were going to do once they got to Earth. So with that said, this episode was necessary, and it's not a filler episode because you kind of needed that to happen, because that's what happened in Resurrection F, albeit a little bit faster because obviously it's a movie. But I felt that this episode was definitely not filler. They added a few little things that made it, a little bit more rich than what it originally was. And with that said, I feel like this episode gave off the feeling of a tension-filled, normal episode, because of the fact that we have tension going into the next episode, because obviously Frieza's coming, and as we saw at the end of the episode, they could sense Frieza from outer space coming down. So it definitely adds tension and excitement for the next upcoming episode. So those are my impressions for this episode. Now, in terms of my most memorable moment of this episode goes, it would have to be the dialogue that Jaco had with Bulma. I thought it was pretty funny, and if you guys read the Jaco the Galactic Patrolman special, you would know a lot of the little insiders in it, in which Jaco basically talked about the fact that time travel is illegal and it's against the rules of the Galactic, and Bulma's like, what's that? I don't know anything about this, which is telling him how irrelevant Bulma views the Galactic Empire. That was one funny thing. And also, I definitely liked the fact that he was so astounded by the fact that not only did Bulma have a half-Saiyan son from the future, but she has a son with Vegeta, who's also basically the prince of all Saiyans. And in addition to that, it's kind of all these little inside jokes, because it goes against what Jaco was supposed to represent in the Jaco the Galactic Patrolman special, where he was basically sent to Earth to exterminate Goku. So with all that said, that was probably my most memorable moment because of the whole Jaco the Galactic Patrolman special as a whole. So guys, that has been my video for today. Overall, I'm going to give this episode 3 stars. I thought it was a solid episode. It wasn't very good. It wasn't great. The memorable moment wasn't as memorable as other moments of Dragon Ball Super. But this episode was definitely, I would say, a little bit above average. It did what it needed to do. And, as fans, this isn't an episode that ticks you off and say, oh, Dragon Ball Super is holding us back. Yes, they did most of what they were doing in Resurrection F, but they made some changes which sets up the future, with Tagoma being there and Goten and Trunks possibly getting in the fray. That adds a lot more towards what this saga can do as a whole. And stay tuned for my predictions, where I'm going to talk about what's going to happen in the upcoming episode of Dragon Ball Super, episode 21. So most importantly, over everything else, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as I always say, to have a great day, guys.